Good morning, everyone. We'll get started in just a moment. Good morning to those joining us now. We'll get started in just a moment. For those just joining, we'll get started in just a moment. Good morning, everyone, and welcome. My name is Rachel Stoll. I'm Senior Vice President of Research at the Stimson Center, as well as the Director of our Conventional Defense Program. And I'm so pleased to be able to welcome you today to what I think is a unique convening of experts to discuss a topic of critical, if often overlooked, importance, the concept of arms for influence. As I'm sure many of you in this virtual room will be familiar with, influence has long been seen, either implicitly or explicitly, as one of the core benefits of arms transfers. In the United States, across policymaking and foreign policy circles, there is an enduring belief that the provision of U.S. defense articles and services is fundamental to generating the ability to shape partner behaviors, even in domains outside of defense and security. It is why, in so many cases, the United States has been reluctant to constrain, limit, or condition its arms transfers to partners, even during moments of intense disagreement. Doing so, as the argument goes, would undercut U.S. influence and widen the policy misalignments between Washington and its partners. Critically, these discussions often reflect growing anxieties around strategic competition and the belief that efforts to draw partners away from the spheres of influence of adversaries depends on U.S. security cooperation and assistance. Or conversely, that limits placed on U.S. security cooperation and assistance cede influence to our strategic competitors. But despite the widespread conviction in the utility of security cooperation and assistance in generating influence, the reality is that these concepts, while resting on firmly held assumptions, have been subject to far too little scrutiny or analysis. It was in this context that the Undersecretary of State for Arms Control and International Security, Dr. Bonnie Jenkins, tasked the International Security Advisory Board, ISAB, which is a federal committee of leading experts that provides the Department of State independent advice and insights on critical aspects of international security, to conduct a brief study on the efficacy of arms transfers as a tool for generating influence in an era of strategic competition. The report, which was published this past October, provides excellent insights into the challenge of defining, measuring, and generating influence through U.S. security cooperation and assistance programs. We are exceedingly fortunate to be joined today by several members of the ISAB, so I'll leave it to them to provide better insights into the report's findings and recommendations, which I encourage all of you to read. We've linked to the report on the event page for today's discussion, and you can also find a link in the chat of this event as well. What I will say is that the report, in addition to illustrating the need for more research on this topic, underscores how important it is to reflect critically on the strategic assumptions that continue to shape the policy and practice of U.S. security cooperation and assistance. With that, I'm thrilled to turn to our panelists to reflect on the report and on the concepts of arms for influence more generally. With the caliber of speakers we have today, going through all of their accomplishments would take the entire event. So for the sake of time, let me provide some highly abridged introductions that do not do their experience and expertise justice. First, we have a special guest with us today, the former Undersecretary of State for Arms Control and International Security, Bonnie Jenkins, who commissioned this study. In addition, we're fortunate to have several ISAB members with us, including Dr. Nola Haynes, who, in addition to her role advising the Department of State, is an adjunct professor at Georgetown University and was recently named one of the top 50 leaders in national security and foreign affairs by our colleagues at CSIS. Among her many roles, Dr. Haynes is the co-chair for space security policy at law at the Women of Color Advancing Peace and Security and a security fellow at the Truman National Security Project. We're also joined by Ms. Heather Herbert, who, in addition to being a member of ISAB and chair of this study group, is also an associate fellow at Chatham House. She was previously the chief of staff to U.S. Trade Representative Catherine Tai and previously founded and ran the New Models of Policy Change at the New America Foundation, where she explored how the intersection of international policy and domestic polarization shaped topics ranging from trade and climate to political violence and nuclear security. And finally, from ISAB, we're joined by Lyric Thompson, who is the founder and CEO of the Feminist Foreign Policy Collaborative, which provides a space for feminists working across various sectors to strategize and advance feminist approaches to foreign policy. She is also an adjunct professor at George Washington University, a member of the Council on Foreign Relations Advisory Committee on Advancing Gender Equality in Foreign Affairs, and also serves as vice chair of the North Carolina Council for Women. In addition to our esteemed ISAB members, I'm pleased to welcome John Ramming Chappell to our discussion. John is advocacy and legal advisor at the Center for Civilians in Conflict, where he engages with the U.S. government and other stakeholders on advancing civilian protection and human rights imperatives, with a specific focus on the laws and policies related to civilian harm, arms sales, and security assistance. John has held a number of different positions in the think tank and foreign policy field and is also a member of the District of Columbia Bar. Last but not least, I'm very pleased to welcome my colleague Elias Youssef, who is a fellow and deputy director with our conventional defense program here at the Stimson Center. Elias's work focuses on the policy and practice of U.S. security cooperation and assistance, which has included his own research on the topic of arms for influence, with the well-known refrain, "If we don't sell them arms, someone else will." And his paper will be also available for you in the chat. Prior to joining Stimson, Elias was the deputy director of the Security Assistance Monitor at the Center for International Policy, and served previously as the campaign and research officer for crisis action based in Beirut. Before I hand it over to Bonnie, I want to just make a couple of housekeeping notes. This is a public on-the-record event. It is being recorded. The recording will be available for later viewing and sharing with your colleagues. We want this event to be interactive, and we're very keen to engage you in the conversation. Our speakers will provide some brief opening remarks, but we encourage you throughout the event to use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, and I'll do my best to pose questions to our panelists during the discussion. With that, let me welcome Bonnie Jenkins to provide some opening remarks. Thank you for joining us, Bonnie.
Great. Thanks, Rachel. Thank you for that introduction, and thank you to Stimson for hosting this event and giving the working group of ISAB an opportunity to discuss the report that they did, the great research that they took upon themselves to actually write what I think is a very timely report. I was very happy to actually assign this particular topic because this was a lot of questions and a lot of, I think, misunderstanding about the process and, what happens in terms of the decision-making processes for security assistance done by the Department of State. So I really saw this as an opportunity to bring in some experts to really look at some of the questions that exist and to really delve into some of these topics related to security assistance that could be provided to, of course, folks here in Washington, including the Hill, but also be a resource for others who just need to know a little bit more about this topic. This is one of 6 reports that the ISAB has done in what I think is a relatively short time, 2.5 years or so, to actually put this together. So I encourage everyone to go to the ISAB site and look at all 6 reports that have been done that relate to many parts of what they call the T family that I led, the 3 bureaus that I led at State Department, because it really does cover quite a few important issues and challenges that we're facing right now. In fact, this report has gotten interest from the Hill, and I know that some of the members of the working group are going to be actually going to the Hill to talk about what is actually a timely topic, particularly at this time when we're having a change in administration. So hopefully they will look at some of these, some of the things that are in all 6 reports as we go forward. I want to, before anything else, just make sure I say thanks to the hard work of the entire board, and for this talk, particularly for this working group. The board is, run very well by Mr. Ed Dorn and Sherry Goodman, who are leaders of the board, as well as the really great work of Michelle Dover, Scott Bone, and Thelma Jenkins, and others who actually run this board on a regular basis. And of course, Heather Holbert for leading this great work, and all the others who are part of this working group and who are here today, Nola Haynes and Lyric Thompson as well for their participation. So I hope that everyone really enjoys this panel. I hope that all of you have had a chance to see the report, but like I said, I see that thank you for putting the studies for the website directly into the chat so that everybody can see it. I'm not going to take a lot of time because I really want to give the floor to the experts who actually took the time to interview so many people, including you, Rachel, for this report, and really just have an opportunity for people to ask questions, because I think that's one of the important things about the ISAB and the great work that they've done. And I hope that you will, all of you will refer to it in the future. We want this to be something that is not in the shelf gathering dust. That's why I'm very happy that we're having the Hill briefing. I'm very happy that Stimson, that you have done this, and we've had a chance to talk to other NGOs and other think tanks and others about the reports. So with that, I'll turn it back to you, Rachel. Thanks again for doing this, and looking forward to this great panel. Unfortunately, I have to leave at 10 for another Zoom. But since this is being recorded, I'll have a chance to really hear some of the great discussion at a later time. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Bonnie, and thank you for your leadership over the last 4 years in your position as Undersecretary of State. It's been a joy to work with you and your team and see all of the accomplishments of this administration in this space, and we wish you all the best in your future endeavors. Heather, as chair of this group, let's start with you to share some insights on the study.
Thanks, Rachel, and thank you so much to you and your team for organizing this conversation. I want to echo all of Ambassador Jenkins' thanks to her team and to our colleagues on the ISAB, and to, as well as the more than 40 folks in and out of government across branches of government who very generously gave us their time. But I also really want to thank Stimson, because the whole point of advisory boards and this kind of report is to spark conversation between the T family of bureaus and the broader policy community, and to get a broader scope of people involved in framing and thinking through not just policy choices, but also how we set up our institutions to do the work. So, in a way, writing the report was only part one. And this is, part two, and quite possibly the more important part of the vision Ambassador Jenkins had in assembling a really diverse and interesting group of thinkers on the board to identify places where, if I could put words in her mouth, she needed or wanted a little help from outside to help move things along. And so now it's our job to enlist all of you in thinking about doing that. The other thing I want to say about this study group is that you see 3 of us who were on it, and you heard a little bit about our bios. What you don't see is the other 4 folks who contained among them, really several careers worth of experience at DoD and state, both as career appointees and as political appointees. So this group really spanned a wide range of substantive expertise and kind of viewpoints. And I want to stress that, because when you hear us talk about the conclusions we aim to, we are really talking about a very diverse group of people who, frankly, when Ambassador Jenkins gave me this assignment, I thought, oh my goodness, I'm never going to get anything by consensus out of this group. But several things really struck the group very, very hard. And so I'm going to start off by just giving a quick overview of those, and then Dr. Haynes and Larry Thompson will talk more specifically about some of them. But the first point that I really can't stress enough is that, as you said, Rachel, we talk a lot about influence when we talk about security cooperation and arms transfers, and we talk a lot about influence outside the defense sphere. But frankly, we were stunned that we really didn't encounter interlocutors inside government, outside government, in state or in defense, who had either a good definition of how we understand influence, or a good measurement of when are we succeeding at gaining influence. And I really want to stress that point, because I think we're in a political moment, and we're now looking at colleagues in Congress who've been very interested in measurement and in having government departments live up to, sort of give themselves targets and live up to them, and really think about quantitative analysis and assessment of what they're doing. And while we found that actually Ambassador Jenkins' team in the Political Military Bureau in particular had been working really hard to come up with some quantitative assessment tools, which were very interesting. But the fact of the matter was that they weren't very well known or understood even outside the PM Bureau. And second, the outcomes were neither well known nor were they used by senior officials in policymaking. So kind of a first point I want to stress is that, and I have to say, I'm assuming this is an extremely educated audience, and I don't need to remind you that U.S. arms transfers make up 42% of the global total. I don't need to tell you that if U.S. security cooperation had its own cabinet department, it would be a mid-sized cabinet department. It would be orders of magnitude bigger, for example, than the cabinet department I ran in the Biden administration. So given the size and scope and importance of the enterprise we're talking about, I think our first finding is that we haven't been very rigorous, and particularly not across agencies, in developing an understanding of, is this actually working the way we think it's working? Folks who know the academic literature know that the academic literature is pretty skeptical on whether and how you can measure influence, and I'm guessing maybe we'll hear more about that from John and Elias. But I just really want to hammer that home as a policy finding as well. And I think that's a policy finding that's interesting to you, sort of independent of your political beliefs or independent of what you think arms transfers ought to be used for. We also, and this is what Dr. Haynes will talk about, we looked at how the edifice of security cooperation and arms transfers is still really operating on Cold War, if not post-Cold War, assumptions about what we do and why we do it. And that was posed a significant challenge when, for the last two administrations, you've had this overlay of strategic competition with Russia and China, which introduces a different set of imperatives, but it's a set of imperatives that we haven't in any comprehensive way come to terms with across the bureaucratic architecture that works on these. And that can lead to some pretty incoherent results, and also, maybe surprisingly, again, given the size and scope of this enterprise, in point of fact, we are spread too thin, and we do not have enough resources for what we are trying to do. And that seems very strange to say about an edifice that is this large, but it reflects that we have piled mission on top of mission. And this will become particularly important when we get to the oversight, transparency, reporting, conditionality set of issues that Larry Thompson is going to discuss. This question of, what tools are you using? What tools are you communicating to your partners that you're using? And number one, do you actually have the tools at the bureaucratic level? And number two, are you actually lifting up what you find to the political and decision-making level? And how could we do a better job of doing that? Because last finding here, and again, surprisingly across the board, heard this from some people I did not expect to hear it from, interlocutors unanimously saying, we're really worried about a strategic competition world where the US might have to do things that are against its values. But we don't want to do that. We think that one of our advantages in the world is where the US is perceived to be operating from a base of values. And that, again, uniformly where I wasn't expecting it, people said, we are concerned about the caution of trading off our values, but we don't want to trade off our values. And I think it's really important for people to hear that the practitioners, the folks who are on the ground day in and day out doing this work, also want to feel that their country is working from a set of norms and laws consistently and all the time. So I'll stop there and hand over to Nola and Lyra.
Thanks, Heather. I do want to hear from Nola on this idea of strategic competition and how it sort of colors or gives us the lens in which we discuss security cooperation systems. So over to you.
Thank you, Rachel, and thank you, Heather, and thank you, Bonnie. But before I kind of launch into coloring in a little bit more detail around strategic competition and part of and also a little bit about explaining the partnership, sometimes disjointed partnership between state and DoD regarding certain authorities. But I also want to highlight and say a huge thank you to the entire ISAB family, as this is probably our last public event together, which is bittersweet. And I am just so grateful to have been part of this amazing body. There were times that I would sit around a table at State and just think, wow, these are some really smart people. Like I would really have those moments quite a lot. And it was just such an honor to be able to serve in this capacity. And I just want to say thank you to all of my colleagues and definitely to Ambassador Jenkins for this vision to convene such a diverse body of thinkers and experts. So with that, Heather gave a really good primer about some of the challenges that we encountered as we were going through um, our our uh, our briefings and our interviews, and it became clear very quickly that there was no agreed upon definition of influence. So what are we talking about? And like Heather also said, not only is the academic literature skeptical about different types of security cooperation agreements that can be entered into, there was also this major cry for cohesion in terms of what are we talking about. So not only do we find that there's a level of a lack of cohesion in terms of what are we talking about when we're talking about influence. Are we talking about what Department of State, what our remit is under Title 22, or are we talking about what Department of Defense remit is under Title 10, right? And if you think about those different authorities, where Department of State, where we are tasked with foreign policy, human rights values, diplomacy first. Everything that we do is from a diplomacy first perspective versus, some of the things that DoD is tasked with specifically that focuses on military readiness and operations efficiency. So we have different things that we are doing. And so under Department of State, when you have ideas, foreign policy, diplomacy, it kind of it kind of helps you think about why it might be difficult to measure versus when you're talking about operations and military effectiveness and efficiency, that's a different kind of measuring stick, right? So in terms of how do we measure influence? Are we doing it well? It really also depends on what sort of how can we develop a way to measure the effectiveness of foreign policy, right? The effectiveness of if we enter into an agreement and our values are up front and center. Do we measure if we have maybe gently nudged a country into performing their tasks differently in terms of human rights? So it's so this idea of measurement, it's an important one, and it will take some innovative thinking to figure out how to measure, especially things, in my personal opinion, on Department of State side. So that's one part of the equation is understanding the different authorities, while Department of State and DoD are kind of, and along also with Congress, tasked to do this major job together. The remits are different. So that's one part of it. In terms of strategic competition, so I'm so engrossed in strategic competition. I tend to like dream about this at night. Like I'm not even kidding. Even in my work in the space world, it's driven by this competition of what is Russia doing? What is China doing? What are they up to? What are they up to? And so in the context of security cooperation, but arms transfers and arms sales specifically, we found some very interesting things. So, as Heather said, we have 42% of the market share, right? We pretty much do business with every country around the world. I'm not kidding. One of the things that we found is that we say yes a little bit too often, that we need to be a little bit more discerning in our relationships and partnerships. We can say no. It's okay to say no every now and then. Selectivity is kind of sexy. Like you just don't want to say yes all the time, right? So that was one of the things that we found over and over from outside of government and inside of government. But specifically when we're talking about strategic competition, let's give a snapshot of Russia. So Russia, is a bit occupied right now. They're really busy. So while we're talking about strategic competition, it's this idea as if Russia and China that we're all competing for the same clients. Yes and no. So where Russia was once the number two in terms of that I want to get my wording correctly here. Russia has kind of dipped in terms of their influence and transfers and sales. So they lost 19 of their 31 clients. 19. That is significant. And then when we're talking about China, which is definitely a smaller player in all of this, they have a different approach. They approach cooperation with development, infrastructure. So, what do we mean when we're talking about strategic competition? If it's framed inside of security cooperation, security assistance, the United States, we are leading. We are continuing to lead in that regard. So, one of the questions that lingers around my mind is while we are challenged to define influence, how are we defining strategic competition in the context of security assistance and arms transfers when we are occupying most of the of the market? So that's kind of a question out there that I hope if some of my students are out there, that is a question you want to tackle and write about. I say do it, but that is one of the things that I think as this work progresses in many different ways, there are some really good and juicy questions out there to dig deeper into and to expand on those ideas. But with that, I will turn it over to my colleague and friend, Lyric Thompson. Well, Rachel first, and then Rachel will. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Nola. And yes, Lyric, we want to hear from you about sort of how you looked at all of these issues of strategic competition and leverage in the context of review and oversight and transparency and human rights, and sort of how it all sort of comes together when we look at the arms transfer enterprise.
Wonderful. Well, I'll echo Nola and Heather's thanks to fellow ISAB members, to you at Stimson, not only for hosting today, but also just for the just plentiful supply of wonderful literature and ideas that that you all have produced on this and other topics, which the study group found incredibly valuable. So thank you for that. And absolutely to Ambassador Jenkins for her feminist leadership. I will just say that the good news in convening this series of conversations, as Heather alluded earlier, was I think some of us were worried we might struggle to come to consensus, but I dare say we found consensus among not only the study group and the ISAB broadly, but also among every briefer that we spoke with, this overwhelming desire for the US to live its values in its security assistance. And I will say that that was in both buildings, in Congress and in the executive branch and in the academia and even in industry. And as someone who spent my background in the human rights world, I will say that I was struck particularly on the point about industry, because it seemed to me that some of our conversations within the building were concerned about either needing to do sales from the industrial base perspective or needing to do sales from the strategic competition perspective, as already discussed. And one of the quotes that really stuck with me was actually from industry. And it was, to paraphrase, "I'm a capitalist, but I'm an American first, and I don't want bad guys to get deals." And so that is certainly my bias and my entry into this work. And I think it was edifying to hear that level of support. Now, easy to say, sure, live your values. Harder to do, as we see on a day-to-day basis. And we took a crack at that in terms of both some high-level visioning goals, ideas or recommendations, several of which we really appreciate having heard from several of you, as well as just process-oriented recommendations that we hope might make some progress toward a little bit more sexy selectivity, as Nola so well put it. So I'll start from the beginning, the very best place to start, and say that there was a sense that there may or may not be clear goals, even within the building, certainly within the interagency, and that the lack of having clear goals with a particular partner means that you're also certainly not articulating those goals to the partner and ensuring from the beginning that your goals are aligned. So one recommendation that we, obviously as a body advising the T family of bureaus, thought would be relatively easy to implement from the very beginning is having that conversation with an eye toward identifying any potential challenges or problems from the very beginning, having a shared sense of what a goal is, and then importantly, committing that to text from the agreement on through delivery and any technical assistance, and obviously monitoring and ensuring that that's happening. There was also a sense that there could be tripwires, I believe was the word that was that we used, that was suggested, of saying, all right, we can have goals, we can articulate those goals. We all know that we live in the real world and that our goals don't always match reality, including tripwires and agreements, and in a ongoing monitoring process, which we believe could be layered on existing monitoring processes. We're not calling for huge new resources and a new monitoring capacity. We understand that folks are stretched and that resources are finite. But there are very good resources that are not being put to use, that are not part of this process, and mean that some of the data that we do have and collect, as Heather mentioned in the beginning, isn't then visible to leadership at the end of the process. So we did hear some process concerns, perhaps that DRL and some of the human rights oriented equities in the process, while part of the process, someone derogatorily suggested that everybody in the building is invited to clear. And we understand that the sense of, if not reality of, bureaucratic delays is not always helpful, but it also seems not to be having its desired impact. And so in that regard, we have emphasized and put forward a recommendation that where there is dissent, there could be a split memo process that allows both of those perspectives, or multiple perspectives if there are many, to again be visible to leadership at the level where decisions are being made. Another quote that made a big impression on me in the course of our conversations was, "It's not that we don't have the right tools, it's that we're not using the tools that we have." And so as a body that is advising specifically the T family, but also state more broadly, and is happy to be socializing these ideas with all of you wherever you sit, we were trying to make as many process-oriented recommendations that the T family could implement immediately, while also recognizing that some of the constraints and also opportunities lie elsewhere. I think important point to note is that Congress is a very important actor and a very salient actor in this enterprise. And so I think there's a goal that working with Congress, we could do some things like, for instance, rationalizing that there's the same kinds of requirements, conditions, et cetera, stipulated for all forms of security, cooperation, and assistance, regardless of which building is doing the work, and regardless of what category that happens to fall in. For instance, Leahy, the human rights conditionality legislation does not apply, and that seems to be an opportunity for congressional action. In the event that doesn't happen, obviously that's something an executive branch could take on at the leadership level by just mandating that a similar or equal emphasis on human rights be applied across the board, and we certainly would endorse that. I know that we are over time, so I want to just make sure that I've ticked through everything that I wanted to say here. I think we also had some transparency recommendations. I think we were alarmed that publicly available information on who we're doing deals with, where, how much, et cetera, used to be available and is less available now. We'd like to change that. That it requires both some action by Congress, but also by the executive branch. We understand that there are security concerns that might mean that not all details are available to all the public all the time, but that where practicable, we would recommend that the transparency be reinstituted where it has been softened and or increased otherwise. And then just finally, I'll say on the piece of strategic competition and reflecting on the conceptualization of risk, it definitely seemed to be a forest for the trees challenge, where each deal is consumed by an individual or individuals looking at it with immediate concerns about denying Russia or China a sale, as opposed to zooming out and assessing increasingly important challenges such as the US's reputational risk on a more consistent and ongoing basis, either the downsides of equipping bad actors, or conversely, the upsides of dissociating ourselves with bad actors once we determine through our ongoing monitoring process that things aren't going as well as we would like them to be. So with that, I'll just say I really appreciated the opportunity to be part of the study and the conversation, and look forward to hearing from our other panelists and questions from all of you. Thanks.
Thanks, Lyric. As I said at the outset, we were very gratified to see the State Department take this topic on and to examine these issues more closely. This is certainly an area in which civil society has been, I think, quite outspoken. And so it is my pleasure to have two experts with us today from civil society who have been researching and speaking about this topic for many years. I want to start with Stimson's very own Elias Youssef, who published a report in 2023 that looked at the notion of if we don't sell, someone else will. and looked at sort of the limits and the metrics, I think that Nola mentioned at the beginning, sort of what are the measures for influence and how do we know if we have achieved it, and perhaps more importantly, what happens when we don't and we still make the same decisions over and over and over. So Elias, let's start with you.
Thanks, Rachel. And it's very hard to go after such comprehensive remarks. It was very useful. So much appreciated, and really huge thanks to the Department of State, to Undersecretary Jenkins, and to ISAB for taking on this project. I think, as the speakers have already said, while the concept of arms for influence is certainly deeply ingrained in the strategic thinking around security cooperation and assistance, it does represent a very poorly understood and as the report indicates, insufficiently scrutinized aspect of what is essentially a very consequential instrument of U.S. foreign policy. And of course, as my colleagues have already illustrated, this is not just an intellectual exercise or a bit of academic obscurity, and I'm sure John will talk to this as well. The concept of influence in U.S. security cooperation and assistance is foundational, and it shapes in really critical ways the broad strategic orientation of the enterprise. And as the ISAB members pointed out, influence is not by any means the only objective in U.S. security cooperation and assistance. The goals of these programs are often multifaceted, overlapping. They differ depending on, as was said, which office is in charge. And indeed, many of these aims provide more concrete and discernible measures of success to a degree, improving partner capabilities, increasing interoperability, or securing U.S. military access over key geographies are just some that security cooperation is intended to achieve. And in some cases, the specific goals for assistance can be ill-defined or not clearly shared across the interagency. Yet, I think in my mind, what inevitably acts as sort of the binding logic for the wide range of supposed ends that security cooperation is either explicitly or implicitly intended to achieve is that the provision of defense articles or services is critical to drawing partners, winning allies, earning either goodwill or leverage to get other nations to align with our perceived interests. And that makes sense. It would be logically inconsistent to improve the martial capacities of a nation with whom interests were misaligned. Why would we bother helping a country fight better if we didn't like what it fought for? And so, I think unfortunately, in so many ways, the conviction and in my opinion, and sometimes it can be almost an obsession with the arms for influence as a concept has led us to fall very repeatedly into that logical inconsistency. I think part of the problem, as Rachel and the other panelists alluded to, is reflected in the axiom that Rachel described in some of the work we've done in the "if we don't sell arms, somebody else will" concept. And I know that I have been a broken record on this, but I think it does encapsulate one of these central tenets that relates to leverage in this context, and that if the United States is too constrained in its arms transfers, we create these openings for adversaries to exploit and an opportunity for them to replace the United States as a security partner, drawing countries into their spheres of influence and thereby eroding our own. But in my mind, I think this thinking, and very especially in the context of strategic competition, has led the United States to engage or persist in security partnerships that deliver frustrating little returns for U.S. interests. And I think as is reflected in the elements of the ISAB report and our own research, there's ample reason to be skeptical of this line of thinking in the, encapsulated in "if we don't sell, somebody else will." And I think there's several dimensions to that skepticism. One being more practical or technical. Very simply, the factors that a partner must consider when weighing the costs and benefits of transitioning away from the United States supplied arms to another country are far more complex than "if we don't sell" would seem to suggest. Certainly, partners can and have looked to other suppliers, but as I said, those transitions come with costs, and depending on the context, they can be considerable. The questions that a country has to ask are there comparable capabilities available in the global marketplace from countries that you have good relations with? Can I adopt alternative capabilities and integrate them into existing, and in many cases, very rigid and complex logistical, sustainment, maintenance, training, and doctrinal infrastructure? How costly financially or in terms of readiness will the adaptation and adoption process be for unfamiliar platforms? It could go on, but as anyone who has tried to, the way I put it, transition from a Mac suite of home devices and hardware to PCs or vice versa, you will have experienced in a microcosm the difficulty of simply switching between systems. And there are, of course, strategic costs that partners have to consider as well. And, one of the principal ones being what risks does pivoting from American security cooperation to cooperation with an American adversary present to not just interoperability on a technical level, but the diplomatic relationship with one of the world's most advanced military powers. But beyond those sort of technical caveats, I think the assumptions encapsulated in the refrain also reflect concepts of influence that are even more important. And I think in the first place, this notion that security cooperation is as fungible as is assumed in this line of thinking, I think would suggest that influence is negligible when it's generated from security cooperation. Why would a partner make any sacrifices in terms of its own interests to align more closely with those of the United States if it could simply trade out the defense partnership for a substitute? But more importantly, I think these concepts also reflect one of the themes in the ISAB report, which is the lack of strategic depth in current approaches to influence in the security cooperation and assistance enterprise. And I think all the panelists talked about challenges in measuring and definitional issues. And I think, it's worth reiterating here, as Heather and others mentioned, the scope of U.S. security cooperation and assistance is vast. The list of countries with which the United States does not have a partnership with is exceedingly small. And to put it in the sexy terms, this is not an exclusive club. That is not the vibe. And in this context, the U.S. fixation with losing out on market share to adversaries and the influence it supposedly jeopardizes has, in my mind, ironically, had a damaging impact on the actual influence that the United States is able to wield. Our obsession with preserving partnerships, even as interests diverge or behaviors deteriorate, for the sake of protecting latent and this nebulous idea of influence, has conditioned partners to believe that their actions, their behaviors, are highly unlikely to damage their access to American defense articles and services. So, to put differently, guarding our influence so jealously, to the extent that it exists, we all too frequently squander it. And I think there are many cases where partners have very effectively leveraged the accusations of bad allyship to coerce the United States into continuing defense partnerships that align poorly with U.S. interests. And I think the results are the perpetuation of security partnerships or the pursuit of new partnerships based purely on the desire to deny the same to an adversary. And I think in this context, it's easy to imagine, and certainly we have seen it very frequently, a race to the bottom where the United States is willing to make its own sacrifices in terms of its values and interests. And I was so pleased to see that the report mentioned that so many within the interagency are disinclined from that line of thinking and that inclination, but collectively and on an institutional bureaucratic level, when you orient your enterprise in this way, you're sort of creating incentive structures that naturally lead you to down that path. And of course, this isn't to say that security cooperation and assistance isn't an important and valuable instrument of U.S. foreign policy. The report cites a number of well-considered security cooperation partnerships that have been paired with good diplomacy and a suite of other levers that have created enduring and meaningful partnerships. But what I hope the report does, as I think Heather and Undersecretary Jenkins mentioned, is catalyze more in-depth and critical conversations, not just about what influence is, but how we think about security cooperation and assistance more broadly. How do we wield this consequential instrument to maximize its benefits and minimize its risk? And there's a number of questions that I still have that I'd love to be able to interrogate further with this sort of lens. How do we elevate and commit to transparency, as was mentioned by everyone, which I'm so pleased by to hear other people talking about transparency, as a prerequisite for better interdisciplinary research and analysis on these critical questions, on measuring influence, on developing better assessment monitoring and evaluation mechanisms. How do we move from thinking just about risks of conditionality to benefits of restraint, as Lyric put it? And what is the value proposition that we make to potential partners? And very critically, what is the value proposition that partners make to us? I think that there is a loss in some cases when we talk about influence, about the symbiosis that's meant to be reflected in a partnership, and not such the transactional approach that was sort of alluded to and mentioned specifically in the ISAB report. I have so much more to say, but for the sake of time, I'm going to pause there and hand back over to Rachel.
Thanks, Elias. You and I will never get tired of speaking about transparency. So glad to have others join the conversation. I want to turn it over to John now to really look at sort of why are we even talking about these issues, right? At the end of the day, we're talking about sort of the risks and the civilian cost of some poorly made decisions, or some decisions that in retrospect probably could have been no's, or we shouldn't be afraid to say no's given the risks that we know are forthcoming. So John, let me turn it over to you to put this in context for us. Why are we talking about this? Why should we care?
Yeah, thank you so much, Rachel, and thanks to everyone at Stimson for hosting, and to my fellow panelists. I'm glad that the State Department commissioned this report. It does a good job at interrogating some of the assumptions that undergird U.S. security cooperation activities. And unfortunately, that happens too rarely, which is disappointing and even dangerous sometimes in light of the fact that the United States has exported more weapons than any other country in the world since the end of the Cold War. And as you've heard now, the report shows that when it comes to influence, the benefits of U.S. security cooperation are likely often overstated or overestimated. So as Rachel said, I want to look at the other side of the scale. What are some of the recurring risks that arise from U.S. security cooperation? And in particular, what are the human costs? And it's important to acknowledge first that weapons are designed to be dangerous. In many cases, they're designed to kill people. And that makes the arms trade an inherently risky business. Now, CIVIC, Center for Civilians in Conflict, where I work, is focused on preventing harm to civilians living in conflict zones throughout the world. And we work on U.S. arms transfers because too often, arms made in places like St. Louis, Missouri, or Middletown, Iowa, or Tucson, Arizona, are used in attacks that kill civilians. And sometimes, U.S. taxpayer dollars pay for those weapons. And in some cases, U.S. weapons are used to carry out war crimes and other atrocities. A couple of specific examples include in Yemen, where the Saudi and Emirati-led coalition for years used weapons made in the United States in attacks that killed civilians and in potential war crimes. That included a 2018 bombing of a school bus in Dakhyan that killed at least 26 children using a GBU-12 Paveway 2 bomb made by Raytheon. And I don't think that I can finish my remarks without discussing Gaza, where the Israeli military has relied on U.S. weapons and attacks that have killed tens of thousands of Palestinians, decimated Gaza's medical system, and made the area all but unlivable. In one example, 18 civilians from the Al-Nofal and Awadullah family in Tel Sultan were killed early last year in an Israeli bombing using a GBU-39 small diameter bomb made by Boeing, even as the Biden administration continued with nearly unconditional support militarily to the Israeli government. And outside of armed conflict, too, weapons from the United States can be used to violate human rights. In recent years alone, we've seen weapons from the US being used to repress protests in Colombia, Peru, Tunisia, and Turkey, among other countries. US weapons, including firearms, can also be used to carry out extrajudicial killings or enforce disappearances. And arms sales and other forms of security cooperation activities can help legitimize the actions of authoritarian or abusive governments by sending a message of US political support. So when it comes to civilian harm, war crimes, and human rights abuses, the use of US weapons can associate the United States and its government and its people with the conduct of its partners. That comes with significant reputational risks, and as Elias acknowledged, it can undermine US influence. That's also true for US training, which can associate the United States with military officers who carry out coups, or with units known for their repressive practices, or with security forces that perpetrate atrocity crimes. Now, arms sales and other forms of security cooperation can also carry legal risks even. In some cases, the United States or US officials may even be found legally complicit for violations of international law. And while it's not where CIVIC is focused for the sake of good policy, I think it's very important to note that when weapons from the US end up in the wrong hands, they can pose a very significant threat to US interests. One good example of this is that between 1972 and 1977, US presidential administrations sold the Iranian government about $70 billion in today's dollars in weapons under President Nixon's so-called blank check policy. And much of that happened before congressional notifications and therefore without Congress's knowledge. And by the end of 1979, those weapons, including top-of-the-line military aircraft, were in the hands of the government of the Ayatollah Khomeini. And even without major political changes and recipient government diversion, especially with small arms, can put U.S. weapons into the wrong hands. For example, 2019 CNN investigation showed that weapons the United States sold to Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates ended up in the hands of al-Qaeda-linked groups in Yemen. So there are a lot of really good recommendations in the report that deal with human rights, transparency, and accountability. And I want to focus especially on selectivity. And as Dr. Haynes acknowledged, the US should probably say no more often. And the question comes down to how to implement that, how to make that a reality. Because every conventional arms transfer policy, since the Carter policy, with the exception of the Reagan administration's policy, committed to restraint, a practice of restraint in arms transfers. The practice, though, has proven difficult. Implementing that policy of restraint has proven difficult. And that's true even of the Carter administration. For example, President Carter centered his 1976 campaign of issues of human rights and arms sales. He said that the US should not be, quote, both the world's leading champion of peace and the world's leading supplier of weapons of war. And although President Carter demonstrated a strong commitment to limiting U.S. arms transfers, including by very quickly developing the first U.S. conventional arms transfer policy, his administration was unable to realize the vision that he set out. So I think it's useful to ask, why was that? Part of it was inertia. President Carter inherited several controversial, high-profile sales from his predecessors that he pushed forward and set a precedent for more sales. Part of the problem was that key parts of the Carter administration weren't committed to implementing the policy. Part of it was that he considered every sale that came across his desk on a case-by-case basis, and he lost the big picture of the objectives that he had set. This is very much in line with what Lyric raised about missing the forest for the trees. And I think in the end, the last nail in the coffin was the Camp David Accords, which resulted in major commitments of arms to Egypt and Israel. When it comes to being more selective, I'd argue that the easiest place to start is to strengthen the implementation of laws already on the books to determine which countries should not be eligible to receive U.S. arms sales. And I am a lawyer, so you'll have to forgive me as I speak a little bit about the law, starting with Section 502B of the Foreign Assistance Act, which prohibits arms sales to countries where the government engages in a consistent pattern of gross violations of human rights. Section 620I of that same act prohibits military aid to governments that restrict the delivery of U.S. humanitarian assistance. Section 3 of the Arms Export Control Act renders countries ineligible for U.S. arms sales if they use U.S. weapons for reasons other than internal security, legitimate self-defense, or a few other specified purposes. And Section 6 of that act prohibits arms sales to countries that engage in a consistent pattern of acts of intimidation or harassment directed against individuals in the United States. It's also helpful to mention the Child Soldiers Prevention Act, which restricts military aid to countries that use child soldiers, but every year the executive branch provides waivers to allow the vast majority of that aid to proceed. These are legal restrictions that are supposed to apply to all countries. They aren't optional and they aren't new standards. They're in the law. Some of them have been in the law for decades, and many of them were enacted with strong bipartisan majorities. But unfortunately, I'm sorry to say, in many cases, they are not implemented well, or they're not implemented at all. Monitoring is an important part of changing that, and so is consistent decision-making from leadership in the executive branch. And that brings me to the broader point where I'll end, which is that improving U.S. security cooperation to meaningfully implement conditionality for all countries is vitally important for civilians in conflict around the world, and also for the United States' commitment to its stated values. Making that a reality is going to require real commitment from senior executive branch leadership, sustained engagement from lawmakers, so I'm very happy to hear that ISAB folks are briefing the Hill, and an understanding of bureaucratic processes and barriers. This report offers important insight, especially into the third category, and an important call to do better. And I'm looking forward to speaking more about it in the Q&A.
Well, thank you to all of you for really insightful remarks about not only the importance of this issue, the context, the strategic issues, the geopolitics that the United States and other countries face when making arms transfer decisions. And we do have time for some questions. We have quite a few already in the chat, and we have some experts who not only were responsible for making arms transfer decisions, but also who have written extensively on these issues. And so I'm going to try and get to as many questions as I can and consolidate some so that they're a little bit smushed together. So hopefully those who have put questions in the Q&A see or hear some of their reflections referenced. And there's still time, so please do add additional comments. I think one of the questions that sort of appears throughout is sort of, this is not a new issue. This is not something that suddenly has appeared in the last 10 years. And while our arms transfer policy is very much rooted in some of the history of the Cold War, it certainly is not just something that has appeared recently, but has existed since the Cold War. This notion of how do we use arms sales and security assistance to accomplish our goals? So I guess the question that the participant posed is, why have we not learned anything? Or, there's been decades of not only the problem, but of experiences. So I'll open that to the floor.
Yeah, Rachel, I'm going to jump in on that. And Gordon Adams, it's great to see you and asking a smart question, as always. I want to flag. So I think a thing that we don't maybe talk about enough is that security cooperation and arms transfers are enormously useful for a number of things. One is they function as force multipliers for the Department of Defense, and the Department of Defense is very enamored of them for that reason and thinks a lot about how to do that. Second, they are part of the habitual kind of currency of day-to-day diplomacy, right? Which is not influenced the way we talk about it, but it is giving me, the ambassador in country, something to talk about. It's giving me relationship building tools. It's giving me network building tools. And I think we often don't, we leave that kind of influence out of our conversations, where if we're honest, that's the kind of influence that that these tools are good for. And we'd be better off if we rejiggered our policy conversations to think about that. The other thing that they're really good for is that little dance that we do in Washington called the deliverable. So when you are scheduling a summit or a high-level meeting, or you are trying to symbolize something new, or you're trying to soften something else you're trying to do, the call goes out across the interagency. What deliverables can we come up with for country X? And arms transfers and security cooperation are incredibly handy for that, and attempting, particularly, frankly, in an age where, as we know, and as Stimson has talked about, the non-defense aspects of our diplomacy have really been fiscally depleted. And so when we reach for tools, very often the defense tools are the ones we have. So we use them. And I think that those are a couple of factors that explain why this doesn't change over time, because there are really profound reasons for it not to change in just the day-to-day functioning of how the bureaucracy works. And the other reason it doesn't change over time, that several of the folks on this panel have alluded to, is that we are whole, and one can blame the bureaucracy for this, but I think that is wrong. Our entire foreign affairs culture in this country is really in the grip of short-termism. And we are very, very bad at balancing short-term outcomes versus long-term outcomes. And as Lyric in particular stressed, we're really bad at balancing short-term gain against long-term pain. And so therefore, you're just always going to turn towards the thing that gives you a little sugar hit in the short term, even if many, many people can see that the long-term consequences are bad. I'm also Rachel, if you'll forgive me, gonna take a moment because it's a question that always comes up, and it's a very legitimate question about the study group and what we wrote and its applicability to Gaza. And we made a deliberate decision that we were not going to delve into specific cases, and that particularly we were not going to be able to get the information that we needed to say anything specific about the conflict in Gaza, and that if we were not going to be able to get specific, sort of to feel good about the level of information we were getting about a real-time conflict, much of which frankly would have been classified, then we were better off not trying to get into specific cases. But I also want to stress that we very carefully wrote a report that every word in that report is applicable to every one of US deals. So thanks for letting me go on a bit.
No, appreciate it. Elias,
Rachel,
did you want to add to that?
yeah, just a little, because I agree with everything that Heather said there. I just wanted to add maybe something as a researcher. I will sit here and make my own claim for my own interests. I think part of the challenge is transparency as well. You can compare U.S. security cooperation and assistance to other enterprises. The one that I always use is the development assistance world. And there, over decades, there has been a vast area of interdisciplinary study on the effectiveness and the impact and consequences of development assistance globally from different countries or different actors, different kinds. And it's really benefited from the availability of very good data, very good insights. And I think that is one component that is missing in U.S. security cooperation and assistance. And I do think that part of the incentive structures that lead to that short-termism that Heather talked about is there is an encapsulation of decision-making that puts a lot of pressure on individuals to meet those short-term wins and to feel very stark jeopardies for sacrificing or making short-term sacrifices. But I do think that transparency to a degree provides a space for debate and discussion that changes or alters the incentive structure and incorporates different equities, more equities that can help orient the enterprise towards longer term thinking and also better lessons learned culture. I mean, I know I did a lot of work assessing U.S. security cooperation in Afghanistan, and I remember speaking with the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction, on what at that time was the largest military aid enterprise in many years. And his frustration was simply that no one was willing or wanted to pick up and learn the lessons, and that he was struggling to get data and things of that nature. I do think a better ecosystem like that would do part of the work of addressing that learning problem.
Thanks, Elias. I know we weren't getting too caught in specific cases, but I do think they're illustrative of some of the challenges that we face. And we have a question about Ukraine and the report characterizing the strength of NATO's alliance over time, holding off a full-scale invasion of Ukraine as a military security cooperation success. But it also says that security cooperation and arms transfers were unsatisfactory tools for shaping non-military outcomes. So the question that the participant has asked is, going forward, how can we strengthen our collective political military ability to respond to crises and deter potential adversarial competitors? I think Nola and Elias, I'll turn that one to you.
I will jump in. I have 2 minutes before I go off and teach the kiddies. So Ukraine is definitely a case study that definitely a few of us on the board that we've kind of been involved with from in one way or the other since the beginning. And so one of the ways that we talked about Ukraine was in terms of speed. So you will people who do this work, you will hear the constant critique of how slow the US security cooperation system moves. And depending on which building you're in, depending on who you're talking to, they will all blame the person that isn't in the room for why it moves so slow. So Ukraine is one of those cases where we were able to get we were able to get different capabilities out very quickly. We were able to bring countries together that were also sending different types of security packages and capabilities. And so why does that case stand out? Why were we able to move so fast, so quickly? So what a lot of people don't know, and one of my frustrations is when we would announce these large security packages, is that it wasn't broken down to explain to the American public that a lot of that was pretty much in storage, right? A lot of that were capabilities that we already had. So we kind of rummaged through our stockpiles, and we sent a lot of what we had, and then we started to build an infrastructure to make munitions and things like that. So part of these large numbers that you would hear, it is the value of all of the hardware that we had and that we were sending to Ukraine. So that's part of why a lot of capabilities were able to make it to Ukraine. And but like I can't say enough about that particular use case and figuring out why were we able to be effective so quickly, and in other situations not so much. Urgency is definitely one of the reasons. That's one of the things driving the speed of what happened in Ukraine, and understanding how important it was for Ukraine to hold Russia, so Russia would not go beyond Ukraine's borders, and then we have a 1939 on our hands, right? So it was this kind of urgency about, wait a minute, we are on the precipice of World War III, and this cannot happen. All hands on deck. While at the same token, to Benjamin's question, to the second part of that, um, you know, outside of that use case, we heard, example after example where there was a bottleneck, for whatever reason. And part of that, we have this really good graphic on page 19 about how sales are supposed to go and where the starting point is. It doesn't always happen that way. And so for a myriad of reasons, it takes quite a long time for some of the capabilities to make it. But what I want to talk about, your question about Paul Mill and how can they work together to deter our adversaries. So what's interesting about that question is when we think about the apparatus of security cooperation, and if we think about strategic competition and what that really means. So Russia has declined in terms of sales, in terms of clients, in terms of their effectiveness within the security cooperation regime. They're getting capabilities from North Korea and Iran, so they are in a very precarious situation. And then we think about China, the way that they deploy, the way that they go about influence is through building infrastructure and development. So the questions are, do we counter, with the exact tools, like for instance, with the libido corridor between Angola and Zambia and Africa? Are we just copy and pasting on the same kind of Belt and Road initiatives that China are engaging in? My question is always about innovation. I truly believe that the copy and paste method is not the way to go in terms of how to best our adversaries, if you want to put it that way. Um, because we have the largest share of the market, are we deterring China and Russia? No, they're just going about it differently, right? And we haven't talked about Wagner and the way that they factor into, Russia's overall kind of security influence, especially on the African continent. But my point is, Russia and China, they are figuring out other ways to do this. So in terms of deterrence, we first have to figure out if what we are doing is working. And collectively, I think this morning we said, kind of not, right? We have to get that part of the equation right before we can talk about effective deterrence, because at this point, we're in a conversation with ourselves. Or, at least that's just how I see it. That's just my personal opinion. But with that, I am 3 minutes over. And thank you so much for this wonderful last ISAB event. It's been amazing. Thank you, Stimson. And I look forward to seeing you all out there.
Thank you, Nola. Very much appreciate your contributions to the study, but also to our event today. Elias, I think you wanted to jump in
Yeah,
there as
this will
well.
be very
Great.
brief so we can move on. I think a couple of points, and this will build on what Nola mentioned. The first is, I think the first half of the question around NATO and as a useful example of security cooperation working, I think it's important to note the intense overlap of existing interests that existed in parallel to the security cooperation enterprise, not as a result of it. I think in the academic literature, one of the main determinants, and it seems very simple, but it's true, which is that existing interest alignment is foundational to the efficacy and the ability to use security cooperation as an effective instrument of foreign policy and diplomacy. I think that was one of the lessons. I mean, there's a number of others that we can touch on. And then one point that Nola made that I think is worth reiterating, that the United States, I think, really fails to grapple with, which is the United States assumes the maximum possible benefit for its adversaries when it considers losing out on a defense partnership. That, despite the fact that we have security cooperation relationships with partners and we know how frustrating and difficult it can be to translate that into useful foreign policy, we assume that our adversaries get everything right with those partnerships and immediately are translating it into leverage, power, access, influence. One of the things that the report does very nicely is points out that we don't have a good understanding of the policy, practice, and strategy of the adversary's so-called approach to security cooperation and assistance. And until we do that, I think the idea that we're talking to ourselves, we might be scaring ourselves and inflating our own sense of risk, which I think speaks to the need to think not just of, what are the negative goals? What are we looking to prevent? Russia having a market here, but what are the positive goals? What do we want to achieve in a security cooperation relationship is a good reframing that I think needs to also happen.
Yeah, I think sometimes it seems a little bit as though we've lost sight of what the purpose of security assistance is. And to not only keep that in mind, but then if it's not working how we intended it to reverse course or to make different decisions as we go forward. And John, I think that leads to the next question. I'm sorry to put you on the spot, but there's a couple questions about the human rights aspect of this and the trade-off between the short-term gains from partnering with a government versus the long-term reputational losses that the United States might suffer, not only when we compromise the principles that we're saying, but by the actions that we're undertaking. And it takes a very long time to rebuild those reputational losses. And I think that we're seeing that right now with regards to not only the U.S. Perception of the United States with regards to arms sales to Israel, but the actions of our allies and partners who have stopped arms transfers to Israel. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the steps the United States can take and has taken, for example, the civilian harm incident response guidance, that may be able to work hand in hand with the policy. So there's policies, there's decisions that are made, and then there's consequences of those decisions. There are steps, we talked about this throughout the event, that there are tools that we have, we're just not always using them. So can you talk about some of those tools with regards to civilian protection?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, this is a very big and important question, one that I could probably talk about for another hour, and I will not. And instead, I'll focus narrowly on a monitoring question, which I think is in line with what you're mentioning of the civilian harm incident response guidance, which is one of the tools that is available. So, I mean, it's important to start by saying that the United States nominally has a program called end-use monitoring that doesn't do what you think it does if you haven't heard of it and don't know about it. And I say this to the broader audience. End-use monitoring doesn't monitor how weapons are used in the end. It is much more about who has weapons and where they are rather than how they're being used. And that was especially a problem in the context of U.S. arms transfers to Saudi Arabia and the UAE during the war in Yemen. The GAO agreed with that, found that was a major problem. It was also a topic that Senators Warren and Sanders engaged on quite a lot and asked a lot of questions to the State Department about. And so the State Department created, in line with the Biden administration conventional arms transfer policy, the Civilian Harm Incident Response Guidance, which is very unfortunately acronymed as the CHIRG. The first step of making good decisions about how, or that are informed by how U.S. arms transfers affect human rights and civilian protection is actually knowing how the weapons are being used in incidents that harm civilians or that are in violation of international human rights law. The CHIRG makes a step in that direction by having a system to compile and assess incidents that are reported when U.S. origin weapons are used to harm civilians. Process is very important, and the United States government should have had something like this a very long time ago. However, in order for processes to be credible and to do what they're intended to do, they need to result in a political level decision to actually impose consequences when there are violations. And this comes down to issues including the terms of sale in U.S. arms sales agreements and also the various legal restrictions that I mentioned. There have been too many examples that I won't go into now, but I think that folks can imagine, where there have been apparent violations of terms of sale or of U.S. law that do not result in a change substantively in a security assistance relationship between the United States and a partner. And so that comes back to what I closed with in my remarks, that process is very important, and having the information and the monitoring and evaluation that is necessary is very important. At the end of the day, everything can look great on paper, but not results in any political level decision on the basis of those processes. I hope that somewhat answers the question.
It does. Thank you. And I want to sort of, I know we're running short on time, but we have this tendency to once we, the United States, not me, Rachel, once we engage in a partnership, it's really hard for the United States to step away. And so we have a question about how do we develop sort of a list of criteria, or maybe it's only a single criteria that policymakers could prioritize for either cooperation, like under what circumstances do we want to engage in that cooperation, or when do we deprioritize those relationships and allow them to fall away? Are there ways in which we can sort of clarify the process and the utilization of all of these tools that we have?
I can start so that I can say things and other people, I don't look silly when people correct me afterwards. But I think as a workaround way to answering this question, I think it speaks to not just the challenge there, but also one of the difficulties of actually using influence. So much about the current approach, as I said in my remarks, conceives of influence as almost exclusively latent, and something that you have to sort of preserve and save, but you're never going to draw down on. And part of the challenge here is partners watch how we react to other partners, they learn and they adapt. And over many years, how rarely we say no, how frequently we are unwilling to remove ourselves, extricate ourselves from a partnership, I'm not saying, close things off or say no to everything, but condition, reshape, reevaluate, is so rare that partners have been conditioned to perceive security cooperation and assistance as part of the status quo, as an entitlement in some cases. And it makes any departure from that status quo feel like a very massive break in the relationship, as opposed to really a mechanism, foreign policy that's demonstrating the proximate relationship, the alignment. It's more of a, as I said, a status quo mechanism rather than a reflection of the partnership, which is really challenging. And I think, I don't have necessarily a great answer. We've done some research that suggests that new partnerships end up faring a little better in terms of efficacy and capacity building, especially because you can start from a basis of without the political baggage that might be associated. But I think a first step is just habituating ourselves to saying no on occasion. I think we would generate an enormous benefit beyond the particular country in question if we were able to demonstrate a willingness when our interests were not being considered in a partnership broadly, particularly in the security realm, that we're not simply going to say, well, that's too bad. We would hate to lose you as a customer. The customer's always right, so please continue. And I would love to, part of the reason I think that there needs to be more research in other countries, competitors, or allies alike. I wonder what the reaction of the adversaries might be, so-called adversaries might be, to similar departures in interest with their clients. Would they react so, submissively in that context? I don't know the answer because we haven't had a chance to study. Would love to look at that, but I think there's some lessons in that thinking that ought to be adopted as well.
Jill, I will jump in and make 2 comments on that. When we first took on this project, I thought one of the things that we would find is that we would look at the academic literature at work done by people like you all, and that we would come out of that with a set of recommendations for, here's what we can say actually works and here's what you should do. And I mean, I came away unconvinced that you can see that very clearly in the literature. I think, Elias, you've just outlined one methodology by which you can do that. I'm also thinking of Alex Noyes over at Brookings, who is doing some work that conceptualizes this as kind of a ladder where you start with lower stakes, non-lethal stuff and move up. And I'll let him and his work speak for themselves. But the other point that I would make that you're going to have to do before you can have anything like the kind of typology you described is get clear on what your goals are. And as I said, you had, I think Trump won and Biden were both very heavily bought into the strategic competition paradigm. And we heard some people describe in a speculative, non-authoritative way that you could use a strategic competition paradigm to have a very targeted idea around arms sales, that you really would pick out countries, a set of countries that you thought were vital, and you really focus on the relationships with them. And other places you'd say, okay, you know what, if our adversaries want to work with that government, good luck to them. But there's another concept of strategic competition that says, no, we gotta beat them everywhere all the time. So, and I'm not at all confident that strategic competition is going to remain the paradigm for our foreign policy at this particular moment. So I think actually that's the first step that would be required. I'm also just going to extend my talking one more second to note that we do have several members of other ISAB study groups who've joined us this morning, and they're not on screen, they're not talking, but just to say thank you all for all of your work. And as Bonnie said at the beginning, do check. So although we're not sure what happens to the ISAB under the future administration, the next administration, the reports persist. We're all around. We are still happy to be out in public talking and thinking and writing about them in whatever capacity we have. So this may be our last official event as the Biden ISAB, but neither the work nor the people is going anywhere. And thank you very much again for hosting this.
Thanks, Heather. I think what we've learned today is that none of this work is going anywhere. These are sort of long-standing challenges and issues that will not only not be solved today, but probably not in the next administration either, or perhaps even the one after that. I think there's a long history of not in the arms trade universe of not always learning from past experiences, and so we seem to have to learn those same lessons over and over again. And I'm hoping that there'll be some incremental changes, not only from your study but from the discussions that it has generated. But I'm not sure, honestly, and I don't mean to end on a pessimistic note, but I'm not sure that these lessons have been learned. It's really important that we keep having these open and honest discussions about the challenges, the realities of U.S. arms transfer and arms transfer decisions. But there's certainly much more that we can do. And this is an area in which Stimson, and I'm going to speak for Civic for a second, that Civic are committed to working on and to continuing to provide analysis, recommendations. Obviously, we need information to do that. So transparency always is paramount to having these discussions, to know what is going where, for what purpose, how it is being used, evaluating that usage. Those will be perpetual areas of interest and study for those of us outside of government, and we hope for inside of government as well. Obviously, we don't know what changes the next administration will bring, but we all remain committed to working with the individuals in the State Department, the Defense Department, the Commerce Department responsible for arms transfers, and ensuring that they are done with respect to U.S. values and principles. Thank you all for joining us today. Again, this is not the end of this discussion. Please watch this space here at Stimson for future conversations on this topic, as well as related topics. And thank you again to Bonnie and to Lyric, Nola, and Heather for joining us today, to John and Elias for your continued great work